Hey guys, before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Close your eyes if you want, or just let the sound play softly in the background. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time to the Pacific Ocean during the Second World War. It's a story about the men who fought the sky itself, the fighter pilots of the Pacific Front, and the quiet truths that lived behind their heroism. I wonder where you're listening from right now. Are you somewhere warm? Or maybe under a blanket as the night hums outside your window? What time is it where you are? It's always interesting to imagine who's out there, listening to these old echoes of history. The year was 1943. The Pacific shimmered under a sun so bright it made the air itself seem heavy. Far away from any mainland, on a small island surrounded by coral reefs and the endless blue, stood an American airfield. The runways were made of crushed coral and metal plates that clattered beneath the boots of the mechanics. The sound of propellers and ocean waves mixed together until you couldn't tell one from the other. That was where Lieutenant David Harris first set foot. He was young, barely 22, but his eyes already carried the dullness of someone who had seen more than he wanted to. He had come from California, from a small town with wide streets and orange groves, a place that felt like a memory now. When he stepped off the transport plane, the smell hit him first. Salt, gasoline, and something faintly sweet, like flowers trying to grow in the wrong place. The base itself was a patchwork of tents, sandbags, and wooden huts. Pilots slept wherever they could find a breeze. Their uniforms were always damp, their boots full of dust and sweat. And above all, the heat, always the heat pressing down like a hand that never lifted. Somewhere nearby, the surf kept breaking against the shore, and the seabirds screamed over the jungle. The men greeted David with nods more than smiles. They didn't bother learning new names too quickly. Out here, names vanished fast, like the planes that didn't come back. One of the older pilots, Captain Moore, tossed him a canteen and said, "Drink slow. Water's worth more than gold out here." David nodded, pretending not to notice how the captain's hands trembled when he lit his cigarette. Everywhere he looked, he saw movement. Mechanics crawling over engines, radio operators wiping sweat from their brows, and men cleaning their sidearms in silence. The war here wasn't loud like in the movies. It was steady, humming, waiting. The Pacific Front was a strange kind of battlefield. An ocean too vast to understand, scattered with tiny islands where men fought over airstrips that looked like scars in the green. That night, the sky turned black in minutes. The islands sank into the sound of frogs, insects, and faraway engines. David sat outside his tent, cleaning his goggles, watching the moon reflect off the wings of parked planes. Around him, a few pilots laughed quietly, sharing a bottle, telling stories that mixed truth and myth. One claimed he saw a Japanese Zero explode into flames so bright it turned the clouds red. Another swore he heard the ocean whispering names when the tide rose. But beneath the talk, there was a silence that felt alive, like everyone knew something they wouldn't say aloud. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the knowledge that, in this place, the sky could swallow anyone without leaving a trace. The next morning, a bugle called before sunrise. The men moved slowly, tying boots, checking weapons, eating canned peaches from dented tins. David looked at his plane, a Grumman F-6F Hellcat, painted dull blue with streaks of oil on the wings. Its propeller gleamed faintly in the dawn light. He ran his hand over the metal, feeling the heat already building even though the sun hadn't fully risen. The mechanic beside him muttered, "You'll learn to hate that sound, the engine before takeoff. It's the sound that means someone's not coming back." David didn't answer. He just looked toward the horizon, where the sky met the ocean in an endless, blinding line. Somewhere out there were the enemy pilots, invisible for now, but as real as the air he breathed. The war hadn't truly begun for him yet, but the Pacific had already started to whisper his name. By the second week, David began to understand what it meant to live beneath a sky that never rested. Every morning the horizon bled into gold, and the heat arrived even before the sun. The airfield shimmered with the smell of oil, sweat, and sea salt. The sound of engines warming up was constant, deep, trembling, alive. The men had stopped flinching at it. It became the heartbeat of the island. Their days followed a rhythm that was both strict and chaotic. They woke at dawn, checked the weather, polished lenses, and scribbled letters they might never send. The officers read out mission lists under the flagpole, and every pilot leaned in just slightly, waiting to hear his own name or hoping not to. Those who weren't flying that day lingered near the mess tent, sipping weak coffee made from powder. They talked quietly, always about the same things. Rumors of Japanese carriers, planes gone missing, and the strange glow that sometimes flickered far over the ocean at night. The Pacific War wasn't just about dogfights. It was about waiting, hours, sometimes days, of sitting under tarps and listening to the waves, watching the horizon for shapes that never came. That waiting hollowed the men out. The boredom was heavy, but it carried fear inside it. Fear of when the calm would break. David learned the small rituals everyone had. Captain Moore, the oldest of them, always touched the left wing of his plane before takeoff. Another pilot, Bill Tex Monroe, kept a silver coin under his glove. No one mocked the superstitions. Out here, they were armor against what logic couldn't protect from. The pilots looked so young. In photographs, they would have seemed like students, not soldiers. But their faces aged fast in the Pacific. The sun burned the softness out of them. Every flight added another line, another shadow beneath the eyes. And when they laughed, it was loud but short-lived, like thunder before the rain. Sometimes, when no missions were scheduled, David would walk toward the edge of the airfield. From there, he could see the jungle spreading endlessly inland, dark, wet, alive with movement. The locals said the forest swallowed anything metal or man-made within a month. He believed it. Rust formed overnight, and the earth seemed eager to reclaim what the war had taken. At night, the men gathered in small groups. They smoked, told stories, and listened to the distant hum of bombers heading somewhere else. The sky glittered with stars so sharp they looked like shards of glass. No city lights here, just darkness and reflection. That's when the talking would quiet down, and someone would say something like, "Think they remember us back home?" Nobody ever answered. David started to keep a small notebook. Inside, he wrote things he didn't want to forget. The color of the ocean at dawn, the name of a pilot who hadn't come back, the strange dream he had where the clouds looked like wings. He never told anyone about it. Some men played cards to stay sane. He wrote, one evening, while inspecting his Hellcat, he noticed the horizon was unusually still. The air smelled metallic, and even the gulls had gone quiet. Captain Moore walked past, glanced at the sky, and muttered, "Tomorrow'll be a bad day." No one asked why. They just nodded, because in the Pacific, bad days had a way of keeping their promises. When night fell, the rain came suddenly, tropical, violent, flooding the trenches and washing over tents. The men dragged buckets to catch fresh water and cursed at the thunder that shook their bunks. David lay awake listening to the downpour, his boots by the cot, ready in case the siren called. He thought about home again, about the orange groves, the smell of dust after rain, the sound of his mother playing piano on Sundays. That memory already felt faded, like a photograph left in the sun too long. The next morning began with silence. No chatter, no laughter, just the shuffle of boots in the wet coral dust. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and glimmering, every leaf still dripping with rain. Over the runway, heat already began to rise, warping the horizon. At briefing, the men stood shoulder to shoulder, their khaki shirts clinging to damp skin. Captain Moore pointed at a map pinned to the wall with a bayonet. The paper fluttered from the electric fan beside it. "Recon over Bougainville," he said. "Light resistance expected. Stay tight. Don't chase shadows." His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too much sky and lost too many friends in it. David's name was on the list. It was written in neat pencil, as if that made it more official. His first mission. He nodded, pretending not to feel the tremor in his hands. Tex Monroe patted his shoulder, a grin hiding nerves. "Just keep your wings level, rookie. The rest's just noise." They suited up in near silence. Leather helmets, oxygen masks, gloves still damp from the night rain. Mechanics worked fast. Fuel hoses hissing, tools clattering, sweat running into their eyes. The roar of engines began one by one, a chorus that drowned out thought. David climbed into the cockpit of his Hellcat. The metal was hot already, the seat rough against his back. He ran through the checklist like they drilled in training, but his mind was far away. Above, the clouds were stacked like mountains, pale and soft. It was hard to believe death could hide in something that beautiful. When the tower signaled, the first plane rolled forward. Then another. David's turn came. He pushed the throttle and the Hellcat leapt down the runway. The coral runway blurred beneath him. Then the ground fell away, and the world became blue. Sky above, ocean below, and a thin horizon slicing them apart. For a while there was peace. The drone of engines blended with the wind, and the sunlight shimmered across the wings. Flying felt like escaping the Earth's weight. Below, the sea stretched forever, dotted with tiny islands wrapped in mist. Then the radio crackled. "Eyes up, 3 o'clock high." David's heart jumped. He squinted toward the sun. Tiny dots, at first motionless, then moving, growing. Zeros. Japanese fighters. Their formation was tight, precise. The sky that had felt so wide now felt suddenly small. "Keep formation," Moore's voice snapped over the radio. "Don't break off." The two squadrons met in the middle of the sky. The silence ended with the first burst of gunfire. It didn't sound like in the movies. It was sharp, violent, over too quickly. David dove instinctively, the G-force pressing him against the seat. Tracers whipped past his canopy, glowing red and white. He saw a Hellcat spiral down in flames. Someone shouted over the radio, but the words tangled in static. The sea rose to meet the falling plane, and then it was gone. David's mind went blank. His body acted on reflex. He pulled the stick hard, the wings groaning. He fired short bursts at a shape that flashed across his sight. A zero, silver and fast. The bullets tore into it, and the plane peeled away trailing smoke. He didn't cheer. He just breathed out slowly, the sound of his own breathing loud inside the mask. Minutes felt like hours. The sky became chaos. Smoke trails, flashes, distant cries. When it was over, there were fewer planes. The survivors reformed, quiet, heavy, engines humming. No one spoke. They turned back toward the island. The return flight felt longer. David watched the ocean far below and thought how easy it was to vanish here. Just one mistake, one flicker of bad luck, and the Pacific swallowed you whole without leaving a ripple. As they approached the runway, the radio clicked again. "Moore's gone," someone said flatly. No one replied. David landed last. When his wheels touched the ground, dust rose around him. The engine whined, then coughed into silence. He sat there for a long time, helmet still on, staring at the horizon. Later, when he climbed out, Tex met him by the wing. "First one's always the worst," he said quietly. "You did fine." David nodded, but his throat felt dry. The sky above looked peaceful again. Crystal blue, empty. No smoke, no sound. It was hard to believe what had just happened up there. That night, someone set Captain Moore's flight jacket on a chair in the mess tent. Nobody said anything. They just left it there, the sleeves folded neatly, as if he'd come back to get it. Outside, the jungle hummed. The sea breathed in the dark. David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the reflection of the burning plane falling through the clouds, silent, slow, and final. The days after the mission blurred together, like heat shimmering over the coral runway. The war had a strange rhythm. It didn't move forward. It circled. One day of chaos, then days of waiting, patching planes, counting losses, and pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. David moved through the camp like someone walking through fog. Captain Moore's bunk was empty now, his nameplate gone. Only the jacket remained, still hanging in the corner of the mess tent, stiff from salt and dust. No one dared touch it. Some things were better left as they were. Mornings started before sunrise. Mechanics yelled over engines, fueling up planes for the next sortie. The air smelled of grease, burnt oil, and the sweet rot of jungle vegetation. Flies buzzed everywhere. When breakfast came, it was powdered eggs and bitter coffee, served with jokes that nobody laughed at. Between missions, the pilots lived in a kind of slow motion. They read old magazines until the pages turned soft from humidity. They cleaned their weapons, even if there was nothing left to clean. They played cards, betting cigarettes they didn't have. And sometimes they just sat, listening to the surf and the constant hum of the generators. Tex Monroe filled the silence with stories. He told them about his ranch in Texas, about horses and storms that stretched across the plains. "You boys don't know wind," he'd say, grinning. "You think you've seen sky? You should see a Texas storm roll over the hills." His voice always dropped when he spoke of home. That's how you knew it hurt. At night, David would walk down to the edge of the island. The sand was coarse, made of crushed shells. The ocean glowed faintly under the moon, pale blue ripples curling toward his boots. Out there, somewhere in the dark, were ships, carriers, destroyers, tankers, moving like silent giants. He could almost hear them breathing. The other men joined sometimes, sitting in a row, smoking in silence. No one looked at the sea for too long. It reminded them of how small they were. Letters from home arrived once every few weeks, if at all. They came in bundles, wrinkled and stained. Some were still sealed for men who would never read them. The sergeant simply tossed those into a wooden box behind the office. No one asked what happened to them afterward. David's letter came from his sister. She wrote about summer carnivals, about how the town still played baseball on weekends, how the sky there smelled of rain. He read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his pocket like a relic. The island seemed peaceful at times. You could almost forget there was a war, until you saw the bullet holes patched with tin, or the blackened spots on the runway where a plane had exploded. The jungle never stopped whispering. The birds called, the wind moved through the palms, and it felt as if the island was alive, listening to every word they said. Once, during a rare quiet afternoon, a supply plane landed with mail, spare parts, and a crate of beer. For a few hours, the base turned almost human again. Laughter came back. Someone played a harmonica, and a group of mechanics danced barefoot in the dust. The sound carried out across the water. It didn't last long, but for a moment, it felt like life again. That night, the rain returned. Heavy, warm, endless. The pilots slept under leaking tents, listening to the drops hit the canvas like small explosions. David lay awake, counting seconds between thunderclaps, thinking about the men still out there, those who hadn't made it back. He wondered if the ocean ever gave anything back. Somewhere in the dark, the sound of an engine echoed faintly. A plane, maybe, or a memory. The men stirred, half awake, but no alarm was raised. It was just another night, like so many others. By the end of that month, the airfield looked the same, but something in its silence had changed. The men still moved through the same routines, checking gauges, greasing engines, eating, laughing, but now there were more empty bunks. The sound of absence had a weight of its own. The base commander stopped holding formal memorials. There were too many. Instead, the men began to make their own quiet rituals. When a pilot didn't return, someone would leave his coffee mug on the table for a few days, untouched. Then one morning it would be gone. No words, no ceremony. Just the unspoken rule that nobody asked who put it away. David started keeping track in his notebook. Not full names, just initials, numbers, a few words. TM, laughed too loud. EJ, scared of storms. Captain Moore, steady hands. He wasn't sure why he wrote them down. Maybe because he didn't trust his own memory anymore. Out here, even grief evaporated in the heat. The mechanics talked less too. They used to joke, even whistle while they worked, but now the clatter of wrenches and the hiss of fuel were the only sounds. The younger ones looked at the sky differently, as if every cloud was hiding something sharp. On some nights, the radio picked up stray signals, ghost transmissions, faint voices speaking half English, half static. The operators said it was just the weather bouncing signals across the water. Still, men swore they heard familiar call signs. Pilots who had been gone for weeks. They'd lean in close, listening, waiting for a word that never came. One evening, a patrol failed to return. For planes, gone without a trace. No smoke trail, no crash site, nothing. The sea had swallowed them whole. That night, no one went to the mess hall. The smell of fuel hung in the air like incense. Tex sat outside his tent, staring at the jungle line. "You ever think," he said quietly, "that maybe the sky remembers what we forget?" David didn't answer. The question didn't sound like it needed one. The next morning, they went flying again. There was no time to mourn. Orders were orders. The war machine didn't pause for grief. As they taxied down the runway, the sun reflected off the sea like broken glass. David caught his own reflection in the canopy and barely recognized the face looking back. He flew with a new kind of awareness, not of heroism, but of chance. Every noise from the engine felt personal, every vibration a possible warning. The first time he noticed smoke from another plane, his stomach dropped before his mind caught up. It wasn't an enemy hit, just a burst oil line. But still, his heart didn't stop racing until they landed. When they returned, the crew chief mentioned casually, "We'll need new filters soon." Then he walked away. That was how people coped here, by naming danger as if it were maintenance. As the sun set, a thin fog rolled in from the ocean. It crawled across the runway, blurring the edges of the parked aircraft. The men moved like shadows between them, finishing their work before dark. When the night finally swallowed the island, the sound of insects rose again. A constant hum that never stopped, even when the world did. David sat by the lantern light, flipping through his notebook. He read the names one after another until the words blurred. Then he closed it, placed it under his pillow, and lay back, listening to the low rumble of thunder somewhere far beyond the sea. For a moment, he imagined the missing pilots flying still, somewhere out there above the Pacific, caught between clouds and silence. He pictured their wings slicing through moonlight, their radios whispering half-words into the void. And in that thought, strangely, there was comfort. Because maybe the ones who didn't return weren't gone at all. Maybe they had just become part of the sky itself. By the time the rainy season rolled in over the Pacific, the airfield had turned into a swamp of red clay and broken spirits. The monsoon came down in sheets so thick you couldn't see 10 yards ahead. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet canvas, oil, and rot. We joked about it, of course, said the rain was God's way of grounding the devils for a while. But deep down, everyone knew it was just another kind of waiting. Waiting in the rain was worse than flying into it. You sat in your tent, staring at the water running down the walls, and your mind started flying missions of its own. Missions that never ended. I remember Captain Edwards sitting on his cot one night, staring at a photo of his wife back home. He didn't say a word, just tore it neatly in half and put it in his flight log. Said it was for balance. That's what the war did. Made men talk in riddles just to keep from cracking open. When the weather finally cleared, we got word of a new mission. Deep strike, long range, targets buried in the jungle, supply depots feeding the enemy lines. The kind of mission you knew half of us wouldn't come back from. I checked my plane that morning, the Lucky 7, as if it were alive. I talked to her softly, touched the nose where the paint had started to chip, and told her not to let me down. Silly, maybe, but the sky made you believe machines had souls. The takeoff was rough, the runway half mud, the engines coughing from humidity. Once we got airborne, the Pacific opened up beneath us like an endless wound. Blue, empty, and cruel. The radio crackled with chatter. Someone's altimeter jammed. Another's fuel gauge went dead. We were a dozen specks crossing a world that didn't care if we lived or died. Halfway to the target, we flew into cloud cover so thick it felt like diving into milk. Static hissed in my ears. Lightning flickered somewhere inside the clouds, lighting up the cockpit like a camera flash. I lost sight of the others. My compass spun lazy circles. For a few minutes, it was just me and the storm, the kind that makes you wonder if death has a shape. When I finally broke through, the sky opened into a sudden calm. The sea below was mirror flat, sunlight spilling through the clouds in golden columns. Beautiful, almost holy. That's when I spotted it. A lone zero, glinting silver against the blue, coming in from the east. Hadn't seen me yet. Could have peeled off, gone home. But instinct overrode logic. I dove. The dogfight that followed was a blur of motion and noise. Two machines clawing through the air, each pilot trying to guess the other's next breath. The Zero was fast, sharper on turns, but I had altitude and grit. I remember the sound of my guns, short, controlled bursts. Then a puff of smoke, and the enemy plane spiraled downward, trailing fire. For a long time, I just watched it fall. It spun lazily, almost peacefully, before it hit the ocean. No parachute, no sign of life, just a faint black smudge on the waves where a man had been seconds before. When I landed back at base, no one cheered. No one said, "Good job." They just looked at me, nodded, and went back to checking their planes. Because up there, every victory felt like stealing something that didn't belong to you. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had started again, soft this time. I kept hearing the echo of the propeller, the crack of the guns, and the silence after. The silence was always the worst part. Somewhere out there, another pilot had a photo tucked in his pocket too. A wife, maybe, or a child, and now it was sinking slowly through the cold, dark water. And for the first time, I realized this war wasn't about sides anymore. It was about survival, and the sky didn't care who won. The morning after that dogfight, the base was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Usually, there was noise, men shouting, engines coughing, the endless hammering of repairs. But that day, everything sounded distant, as if the whole island was holding its breath. Maybe it was because the rain had finally stopped, and the sky looked too clear for what we'd all been through. The sun rose behind the palm trees, sharp and golden, but it didn't feel warm. I sat near the mess tent, holding a tin cup of cold coffee that tasted like rust and smoke. Across from me, a mechanic named Larson was fixing a bent propeller blade. He worked without talking, his movements slow, deliberate. Then, without looking up, he said, "You got the 0 yesterday, didn't you?" I nodded. He didn't congratulate me. He just said, "You ever think maybe he thought he was the good guy too?" And went back to hammering. That question stayed with me. The more I thought about it, the less I knew what good even meant anymore. Out here, the lines blurred fast. You started the war believing you were part of something noble, defending freedom, protecting the innocent. But as the months dragged on, it felt more like survival theater. The same sun shined on both sides. The same salt burned in our sweat. Later that day, Command called a briefing. Another mission, escort duty this time. Bombers heading for a small island chain north of Truck Lagoon. Enemy resistance expected. We all listened in silence. The only sound, the soft scratching of pencils on maps. Nobody asked questions anymore. We just nodded and prepared. Orders had become a kind of religion, not because we believed, but because we needed something to follow. Before takeoff, I went to the edge of the airstrip and looked out at the ocean. The surf was calm, but far away, the horizon shimmered with heat. It was strange how peaceful it all looked, like the world had forgotten there was a war. I remember thinking, if someone from home could see this place, they'd never believe what it felt like to live here. The photos in the papers showed smiling pilots with clean uniforms and victory flags. But they never showed the mold growing on your boots, the constant hum of mosquitoes, or the way the night whispered like a graveyard. The mission went bad fast. The bombers were late, fuel was running low, and the enemy was waiting. They came at us from the clouds, fast, coordinated, precise. I saw one of our planes take a direct hit and explode midair, the debris scattering like confetti across the sea. Another pilot, Jenkins, went into a spin trying to dodge tracer fire. I could hear him shouting over the radio, voice breaking, until it cut to static. I tried to cover him, but the sun was in my eyes. By the time I regained sight, he was gone, swallowed by the blue. Just like that. One moment he was there, a friend, a voice, a heartbeat. The next, the sky took him. When we finally limped back to base, only half the squadron made it. Larson was waiting on the runway, hands black with grease, watching silently as we landed one by one. Nobody spoke. We just looked at the empty spots where the missing planes should have been. That night, I wrote in my logbook for the first time in weeks. I didn't write about the battle or the kills or even the losses. I wrote about the silence, the unbearable quiet after everything stops. That's the part no one tells you about. The noise ends, but the war keeps echoing inside your head. Sometimes, I'd wake up thinking I still heard engines, still felt the pull of gravity in a dive. And then I'd remember, the engines were gone, the men were gone, but the sky was still there, waiting. Always waiting. You start to realize something out there, that every time you return, a piece of you doesn't. It stays in the air, somewhere between the clouds and the sea, drifting with the ghosts of everyone who never made it back. The next few weeks passed in a haze of heat and humidity. The island pulsed with life, insects droning, the surf pounding against the shore, engines humming even in the quiet hours. But for the pilots, life existed mostly in the sky. Each sortie was a chance to survive, and each survival felt like a loan you weren't sure you could ever repay. One morning, we received word of a supply convoy spotted just beyond Truck Lagoon. Orders were clear: intercept, harass, and return. Simple enough in theory. The reality was always different. David and the rest of the squadron climbed into their Hellcats, engines whining, hearts hammering, and took off over a Pacific that seemed calm and endless. The ocean stretched out like glass below, reflecting the sun in waves of molten silver. A false serenity, because the enemy was already in the clouds. Japanese Zeros appeared like shadows, dissolving from the horizon, their silhouettes sharp and menacing against the light. The first shot came almost immediately. A tracer zipped past David's canopy, hot and fast. He ducked instinctively, twisting the stick, feeling the G-force press him into the seat. Dogfights were chaotic, not graceful maneuvers, but violent, precise reactions to the enemy's sudden decisions. David chased a Zero diving toward a bomber, fired short bursts, and watched smoke spiral from its engine. It banked sharply, trying to evade, but the bullets found their mark. The enemy plane spun into the ocean below. The moment felt hollow, even triumphant. Above and around him, the sky was full of movement. Flashes of silver, bursts of fire, contrails slicing through clouds. The roar of engines, the staccato of gunfire, and the distant cries of pilots over the radio all blended into a deafening symphony. For the first time, David realized that no one really wins up there. You either survive or you become part of the sky. After the engagement, the squadron regrouped. A few planes were missing. Some engines were smoking. Faces were pale under the helmets, eyes wide and staring. The survivors turned back toward the island, each pilot quiet, thinking about the ones who would never make it home. Back on the runway, Larson and the mechanics worked quickly to patch the planes. But the sound of their hammers and wrenches felt strangely distant, almost irrelevant. Everyone knew the enemy was still out there. They were always out there. That evening, David walked along the shoreline, letting the sand sink between his boots. The sky was painted with orange and violet, calm in appearance, but he knew better. He thought of the enemy pilots, young men, far from home, facing the same fear he did, trusting the same machines to carry them through the clouds. Death didn't care whose side you were on. As night fell, the stars emerged, sharp and cold. Somewhere in the dark, a plane droned overhead. Maybe one returning, maybe one lost. The Pacific stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent. David lay down on the sand, listening to the hum of insects and the surf. The memories of the day's fight replayed over and over. The Zero diving, the tracer rounds, the bomber spinning into the sea. Each image burned itself into his mind. He wondered if the pilots on the other side remembered their friends like he remembered his. Or did they, too, feel the same quiet terror, the same weight of flying and surviving, each heartbeat a silent prayer for safety that the ocean would not answer? Somewhere out there, a voice over the radio muttered, "Keep your eyes open. He's still out there." The words were vague, but they carried meaning. The enemy was real, unseen, always ready to strike. And in that vast Pacific sky, you learned quickly that survival was not courage nor skill. It was a matter of timing, instinct, and a little luck. The night settled, quiet except for the waves. David stared at the horizon, knowing tomorrow would bring the same chaos. The sky would call again, and he would answer as he always had. Because up there, between the clouds and the endless blue, there was only one law: keep flying or don't come back at all. Nights on the island were a different kind of battle. The sun had vanished, leaving the world steeped in a thick darkness that seemed to seep into the bones. The jungle whispered constantly, leaves brushing against each other, insects singing in a rhythm that never stopped. Somewhere far away, the surf crashed against coral reefs, its pulse like a slow drumbeat marking time that nobody kept. David often walked along the perimeter of the airfield, flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust to the moonlight. The night was alive, full of shapes that moved just beyond vision. Shadows of palms twisted in the wind, and sometimes he swore he could see figures watching from the jungle edge. Most of the time it was imagination. Other times it was patrols of Japanese soldiers or scouts who moved silently, ghosts themselves. Sleep was rare. The few hours between sorties were stolen, restless, punctuated by dreams that felt more real than daylight. In these dreams, engines roared endlessly, guns fired without pause, and friends who had been lost returned only to vanish again. David woke drenched in sweat, ears ringing from phantom gunfire. Each night felt like rehearsal for something he could never fully control. The airfield, when seen at night, was a study in contrasts. Lanterns glowed dimly along the tents, casting long shadows. The planes, lined up like sleeping beasts, reflected the stars faintly on their polished surfaces. Mechanics moved quietly, inspecting engines, checking fuel lines, tightening screws, their faces painted with exhaustion. And everywhere, the smell of wet earth, oil, and salt. Occasionally, rumors circulated among the pilots. Stories of enemy planes silently shadowing the base at night, of mysterious lights in the jungle, of men who went missing without a sound. Some said it was Japanese scouts. Others whispered about spirits of those who had fallen over the ocean, their ghosts lingering in the humid air. David didn't know what to believe, but the stories kept him awake, each one a small warning. One night, a young pilot named Avery disappeared. No plane, no trace, just gone. A few of us went searching along the shoreline, torches cutting through the darkness. All we found were his footprints in the sand, abruptly ending at the water's edge. The ocean had claimed him, or perhaps something deeper in the jungle. We returned silently, the weight of the unknown pressing down on us. Even when the missions weren't flying, the night was dangerous. Wild animals prowled close to the tents, snakes slithering through underbrush, insects carrying disease in the humid air. And always, there was the constant hum of planes, engines being warmed for tomorrow's mission. No one slept fully. The island demanded vigilance, whether you were on duty or not. David found himself drawn to the shoreline night after night. He would sit with his boots in the sand, watching phosphorescent waves pulse along the coral reef. The sea glowed faintly, ethereal, almost alive. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of an engine would drift faintly over the water, maybe real, maybe a phantom. And in those moments, he realized that the island itself felt like a living witness to all that had happened and all that was yet to come. During these nights, he began to write in his notebook again. Fragments of thoughts, sketches of clouds and aircraft, notes on men who had been lost. Writing became a way to hold onto some piece of sanity, a way to fight the darkness creeping into his mind. Each page was a tether to reality, even as the world around him blurred. And yet, despite the fear, despite the losses, there was a strange beauty in the nights. The stars shone sharper here than anywhere he had known. The air smelled of salt and growth, and the ocean whispered secrets that were too old to understand. For a brief moment you could forget the war, but only for a moment, because the next day the sky would call again, and it would demand everything. Out here, among the endless waves and tangled jungle, stories grew faster than the palm trees. The men called them legends, but every pilot knew they were more than just tales. They were warnings, omens, reminders of what the Pacific could take from you without asking. One of the first legends David heard was about the ghost carrier. No one had ever seen it clearly, but every so often, men reported spotting a massive silhouette on the horizon, emerging from the mist like a shadow from another world. Planes that flew too close sometimes vanished, or came back damaged beyond repair. The carrier didn't fire, didn't move in any predictable way. It was just there, waiting, and the men learned to respect the space around it. Some said it was a Japanese trap. Others whispered that it was a phantom, a memory of war itself refusing to let anyone leave unscarred. Then there were the Sky Watchers. They were never seen, only felt. Pilots who flew at dawn sometimes spoke of shapes in the clouds, figures that seemed to track their every maneuver. A slight turn of the head, a flicker in the clouds, gone before you could confirm it. Those who claimed to see them said that the Watchers didn't attack, but that the moment they appeared, something in the air shifted. Engines hummed differently, guns jammed, compasses spun. Experienced pilots would nod knowingly and tighten their grips on the controls, but never talk about it outside of hushed circles. Local lore crept into the base too. Islanders told of spirits in the jungle, long-dead warriors, their souls restless, guiding or warning those who entered their territory. Supply pilots sometimes went missing near the inland paths, and the few who returned spoke of strange lights flickering between the trees, whispers in languages they couldn't understand. Some believed it was the jungle itself, alive, angry, protective. Others insisted it was a reminder that out here, you were never truly alone. David began to notice that the legends weren't just entertainment. They influenced how men flew. You learned to respect the shadows, to watch for things you couldn't see, to anticipate danger that wasn't on the map. They became part of the rhythm of life, woven into every pre-flight check, every glance at the horizon. Flying wasn't just skill anymore, it was intuition, fear, and a kind of trained superstition. One evening, David sat by the edge of the airfield with Tex Monroe. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like shards of glass. "Ever hear about the Phantom Squadron?" Tex asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. "They say it's a group of pilots who never came back," Tex continued. "Their planes appear out of nowhere sometimes, flying high above the storm clouds. You can't communicate with them. They just watch, and if you make a mistake, well, they'll remind you." David laughed softly, but the hairs on his neck stood on end. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his tent, imagining silver planes glinting in moonlight, carrying voices from the past. The sound of the ocean and the jungle mixed with the echo of engines, and for a long time he couldn't tell where the world ended and the legends began. Some stories were comforting, others were warnings, and all of them were true in the Pacific in one way or another, because here the ocean didn't just swallow men. It swallowed certainty, it swallowed sleep, it swallowed memory, and it left only the sky, endless, demanding, and full of secrets. David realized that the legends were not just tales told to scare the rookies. They were guides, warnings, lessons etched into every man who survived here. If you ignored them, the Pacific would make sure you remembered. And somewhere, beyond the clouds, beyond the horizon, the sky waited, always waiting. Flying over the Pacific wasn't just a battle with the enemy. It was a battle with nature itself. The sky could be your friend one moment and your executioner the next. David quickly learned that the ocean and the weather were as unpredictable as any Zero or bomber. One afternoon, we were dispatched on a reconnaissance mission over a string of small islands. The sun was blazing, the air thick with humidity. At first, everything seemed normal. Smooth skies, calm winds. Then, almost without warning, the clouds began to gather like a wall, dark and heavy. The horizon shimmered unnaturally as heat and moisture combined, and suddenly, we were flying into a storm that appeared from nowhere. The rain hit with such force that the canopy rattled. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. David felt the Hellcat shudder with every gust of wind. He was gripping the controls so tightly his knuckles turned white. Lightning split the sky around them, jagged and brilliant, illuminating the ocean in terrifying flashes. Thunder rolled across the clouds, each boom making the plane shake as if the sky itself were striking it. Flying through storms wasn't just dangerous, it was disorienting. David struggled to keep his bearings, instruments spinning wildly in the electrical disturbance. Pilots shouted over the radio, but the static was thick. Some of the squadron dropped out of sight entirely, swallowed by the clouds. Moments later, a flash of silver would appear. A plane emerging from the storm, battered and dripping, but still alive. Then came the wind shear, powerful, invisible currents that could throw a plane off its path in an instant. David fought to stabilize the Hellcat, but the forces were unpredictable. Every dive, every turn was a fight for survival. The ocean below roared as if responding to the turmoil above, each wave cresting like a mountain. He realized that no training, no experience could fully prepare a pilot for the fury of nature unleashed. Birds became an unexpected hazard. Flocks would rise suddenly from the islands, startled by the storm or by the aircraft. A collision with even a small bird could shatter the canopy or damage vital controls. David narrowly avoided one mid-turn, the sound of feathers striking the metal leaving a ringing in his ears. It was a small reminder that even the smallest elements of nature could be deadly. And then there were the nights when the ocean glowed with bioluminescence. From above, it looked like the water was alive, shimmering with ghostly blue fire. Some pilots swore it was beautiful, calming. Others, like David, found it eerie. A reminder that the same waters that could illuminate the night could just as easily swallow you whole without leaving a trace. On one particularly harrowing mission, a typhoon approached. The storm had grown from a small disturbance into a massive wall of wind and rain. Pilots who had been flying for hours reported instruments failing, compasses spinning wildly, and visibility dropping to zero. Some planes didn't return that day. Others landed barely intact, engines screaming, drenched in salt water, shaking from adrenaline and fear. The base learned quickly to respect the power of nature. You didn't just fight the enemy here, you survived the elements themselves. Every flight brief included not just mission details, but weather patterns, wind direction, and the odd story from an older pilot who had seen something in the clouds that no man could explain. Legends and nature intertwined. A storm was both a test and a teacher, and when the sky raged, even the bravest men understood they were at the mercy of forces far beyond human control. David began to look at clouds differently. Every formation, every flicker of wind, became a sign, a signal. The sky could betray you, yes, but it also guided those who paid attention. Out here, a pilot had to read the world as carefully as he read his instruments. One mistake, one ignored sign, and the Pacific would take him, no questions asked, no mercy given. That night, as David lay awake, he could still feel the storm's pulse in his chest. The ocean hummed outside his tent, indifferent. The jungle whispered in the darkness. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, the sky waited for the next flight, the next challenge, the next reckoning. Survival in the Pacific didn't come free. Every day, every mission demanded a toll, not just on the body, but on the mind. David began to notice the invisible scars accumulating with each flight, each close call. Some were obvious, burns, bruises, torn uniforms, but most were hidden, lodged deep in thought and memory, creeping into sleep and silence. After returning from a particularly brutal sortie over a heavily defended island, David sat on the edge of the runway, watching mechanics patch bullet holes in the wings of planes like surgeons repairing fragile bodies. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with sweat and salt, thick in the humid air. Around him, pilots moved silently, some speaking in hushed tones, others lost in their own thoughts. Survival here wasn't celebrated. It was expected. The cost was measured in absences. Every day, someone didn't return. Sometimes it was clear, a plane downed in combat. Other times, men disappeared into the mist, lost to storms, the ocean, or the uncharted jungles of islands they were sent to reconnoiter. Each absence left a void, an unspoken reminder that every choice, every maneuver, carried weight far beyond the immediate danger. David's own luck began to feel like a burden. He returned from missions untouched physically, but his mind carried echoes of what he had seen. Men burning, planes spiraling into the sea, clouds heavy with lightning, the smell of gunpowder and smoke. At night, the shadows of lost comrades haunted the corners of his tent, flickering in the lantern light. Sleep became a fragmented, shallow affair, punctuated by dreams where engines roared endlessly and gunfire never ceased. Some pilots found ways to cope. Tex Monroe smoked more than ever, his humor growing darker, sharper. Others turned to letters from home, clinging to the words of loved ones like life rafts. But most simply carried on, performing their duties mechanically, training themselves to block out the fear, the grief, the knowledge that survival today did not guarantee another sunrise. The psychological cost revealed itself in small ways. A twitch of the eye when a shadow moved too quickly, a hand tightening around a flight stick, a sharp intake of breath at the hum of engines in the distance. Sometimes, a pilot would stand motionless on the airfield, staring at the horizon for no reason anyone could name. These were not moments of heroism. They were the price of living when death was always nearby. David began recording these observations in his notebook, not just names and dates, but feelings, moments, and thoughts he feared he might forget. He wrote about the loneliness, the relentless pressure, the weight of decisions made in split seconds that could mean life or death for himself and his squadron. Each entry was a struggle to understand what it meant to survive while others did not. There were rumors, too, of men who could not cope. Some broke down entirely, wandering into the jungle or disappearing in storms, only to be found, or sometimes never found at all. Survival wasn't just a physical act. It was a mental endurance test that few truly passed without paying some hidden cost. Even victories carried a price. Shooting down enemy planes, completing missions, returning safely. Each one reminded David of the men who hadn't. The Pacific was indifferent to triumph. It measured nothing but the endurance of the living and the weight they carried. Every flight, every maneuver, every glance toward the horizon was a negotiation with fate, a wager where the stakes were life itself. As night fell over the island, David lay awake in his tent, listening to the hum of insects and the whisper of the wind through palm fronds. The ocean's pulse mirrored the beat of his own heart, steady yet strained. He knew that each sunrise would bring the same choice again: fly or risk being consumed by the Pacific, both sky and sea, and hope that survival did not come at too high a price. Amidst the constant chaos of flying, storms, and the looming threat of enemy fire, letters from home became the fragile tether that kept many pilots grounded in reality. For David, the small envelopes carried more weight than any briefing or mission order. They smelled faintly of paper and ink, reminders of a world untouched by war, a life that seemed distant yet achingly close. He remembered the first letter he received from his family. It had arrived battered, corners damp from the journey across the Pacific, but the words inside were crisp and familiar. His mother wrote of the garden back home, of sunflowers taller than he had remembered, of neighbors gossiping in the quiet town streets. His father wrote about the machinery he had repaired, the cattle he tended, and the small victories of ordinary life. These letters were mundane, yet to David, they were treasures, glimpses of normalcy in a world that had turned upside down. Yet letters were also double-edged. They reminded you of what you had left behind, of moments missed, of birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet conversations. Some pilots avoided reading them, afraid that longing might slow their reflexes or cloud judgment. Others devoured each word, committing phrases to memory, repeating them under their breath as they climbed into the cockpit, engines roaring, clouds looming, and the horizon always uncertain. David learned to cherish the ritual of writing back. Even if the words felt hollow, even if he couldn't fully convey the intensity of what he experienced, he wrote with care. He described sunsets over the islands, the relentless hum of engines, the occasional beauty of the ocean lit by phosphorescence at night. He avoided the details of combat, knowing that such knowledge would only worry those he loved. But he also understood that omission carried its own weight, a subtle lie woven into the fabric of survival. There were moments when letters became a lifeline for the psyche. Reading about his sister learning to play the piano, about friends laughing at harmless pranks back home, David could almost forget the humidity, the insects, the omnipresent tension in the air. For an hour or two, he could remember what it was like to breathe freely, to be a boy in a small town, to exist without the constant expectation of danger. And yet, letters could bring grief as well. Some never arrived, lost in the chaos of war, or intercepted, or delayed for months. Pilots would sometimes hear the news secondhand. A sibling had been injured, a parent had passed away, a hometown friend had joined the ranks and fallen in battle. Each missing envelope, each delayed note, gnawed quietly at the heart, a reminder that while survival was temporary, the world outside continued to move, indifferent to those locked in the Pacific skies. David discovered that these letters also created connections among the men at the base. Pilots would gather in the evenings, reading excerpts aloud to one another, sharing news from home, creating a fragile sense of community. It was a brief reprieve from the tension, a fleeting glimpse of what they all had left behind. The words became stories, laughter breaking out despite exhaustion, tears quietly wiped away before anyone could notice. But the letters, no matter how cherished, could never fully shield the pilots from reality. The Pacific was relentless, the sky unforgiving. Engines would scream, clouds would thunder, and enemy fire would always return to remind them that the world of paper and ink existed in a different plane. One separated by thousands of miles and an ocean that demanded vigilance, precision, and sometimes the ultimate sacrifice. That night, David pinned the latest letter above his cot. The handwriting was familiar, looping, and careful. He stared at it, letting the words sink in. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to imagine the world outside the war, to remember that there were lives beyond the Pacific. But the next day would come, and with it, the cockpit would call, and he would climb back into the machine that both saved and endangered him, carrying the memory of home like a secret talisman into the vast, indifferent sky. Flying over the Pacific, close calls were less an exception and more the rule. David quickly learned that survival wasn't about skill alone. It was about instinct, timing, and a faint whisper of luck that could vanish in an instant. Some days you walked away with your plane scorched and your nerves frayed. Other days you were gone without a trace. One mission began innocuously enough. Intelligence had reported enemy submarines near a small atoll, and we were sent to scout and, if possible, engage. The sky was clear, deceptively calm, the ocean stretching like a mirror below. As we approached, a sudden burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted from hidden positions on the island. Tracers whipped past David's canopy, the impact reverberating through the metal frame. The first instinct was to dive, to escape the line of fire, but every movement had to be precise. One wrong turn, and the air could claim you. He banked sharply, engine roaring, narrowly avoiding a second volley that shredded the water behind him. Below, the ocean erupted in white plumes, fragments of shells that could have ended a man's flight instantly. His heart pounded in rhythm with the engines, and for a few terrifying moments, he realized he could feel death brushing against him, tangible and almost familiar. Another close call came from the sky itself. While evading anti-aircraft fire, David spotted a squadron of Zeros peeling off from the cloud cover. There were too many, and they had the advantage of position. His flight maneuvered in tight formation, trading altitude for speed, every pilot acutely aware that a single mistake could mean disaster. The Zero pilots were skilled, almost impossibly so, twisting and diving with a grace that belied their intent. David's fingers were raw on the controls, eyes scanning for movement, every nerve screaming. A bullet tore through his wing, and he felt the vibration change instantly. A subtle, terrifying difference that told him he had seconds to act. He dove toward the ocean, forcing the pursuers to adjust, then climbed sharply, using the sun to blind them. One by one, he shook the enemy off, but the cost was clear. Fuel was lower than he liked, and his plane bore scars from the engagement. The most harrowing close calls were often invisible. Lightning storms, sudden wind shear, and thermals could destabilize even the most experienced pilot. On one reconnaissance run, David's instruments went haywire as the plane passed through a microburst, a violent column of rising air. He fought to maintain control, feeling the Hellcat lift, dip, and shake violently, every second stretching into eternity. One wrong adjustment could have thrown him into the water below at hundreds of miles per hour. After landing, hands shaking and drenched in sweat, David walked along the airfield, noting the subtle tremor in his legs. No one congratulated him. There was no celebration for surviving what others had not. Close calls were not victories. They were reminders, stark, silent, that the Pacific did not forgive, and the sky did not care. The psychological weight of these moments was relentless. Pilots replayed near misses over and over, imagining alternate outcomes where one slight miscalculation meant the end. Sometimes, staring at the horizon, David would see shapes in the clouds that weren't there, shadows that seemed to watch, echoing the moments he had narrowly survived. Yet, amidst the fear, there was an odd clarity. Close calls sharpened awareness, honed instincts, and forged a bond between pilots that transcended words. Each survivor carried a tacit understanding of what the other had endured, an unspoken respect born of shared peril. Every near-death experience became a silent testament to endurance, skill, and luck, an unrecorded chapter in a warbook written in sweat, smoke, and adrenaline. And as night fell on the island, the airfield quiet except for the distant lapping of waves, David knew the next mission would bring more danger, more close calls. But he would climb into the cockpit again because that was the law of the Pacific sky. Survive, adapt, and fly, or be claimed by the sea below and the clouds above. As David gained experience, the command began to shift responsibilities onto his shoulders. Leadership in the Pacific wasn't just about giving orders. It was about carrying the lives of men in your hands, a burden heavier than any pack or fuel load. Each decision had consequences, and in a world as unforgiving as this, the wrong call could end everything in an instant. He found himself briefing younger pilots, explaining flight patterns, evasive maneuvers, and what to expect when the enemy was near. But it wasn't enough to teach skills. He had to teach judgment, intuition, and the acceptance that fear was constant. "Don't let your nerves fly your plane for you," he would say. But the truth was, every flight demanded a balance between control and surrender to forces beyond comprehension. The ocean, the sky, and the enemy. Responsibility weighed heaviest when assigning missions. Who would fly first? Who could handle low-fuel runs or dangerous recon over fortified islands? David learned to read men as much as maps, noticing trembling hands, quiet looks, and fleeting hesitation. Some could handle more than they realized. Others could crumble under the strain. Decisions were never easy, and the airfield seemed smaller, tighter, more pressing every time a sortie was scheduled. One afternoon, a critical mission came down, a strike on a heavily defended Japanese airfield. David was given authority to assign pilots to various roles: fighters to cover bombers, scouts to observe flanks, and the riskier recon runs to those he judged steady. As he looked at each face, noting their fatigue, their tension, he realized that leadership here wasn't about heroics. It was about survival, calculation, and trust. Every assignment was a gamble, and every return would test his judgment. The pressure wasn't confined to the air. At night, when engines were off and the island fell silent, the weight of choices pressed in. David would sit by his cot, reviewing mental maps, flight logs, and personal observations. He thought of the men in his squadron, their families, their fears, and their hopes. In those quiet moments, command was a silent, invisible presence that never let go. Mistakes would not only cost him, they could cost others their lives. And yet, command also brought unexpected lessons. It forced him to observe, to predict, to understand patterns of weather, enemy tactics, and human behavior. He noticed when a pilot hesitated slightly on takeoff, or when a wingman grew too confident, or when someone's instincts were sharper than experience. Every detail mattered. Leadership was less about issuing orders and more about perceiving the invisible threads that connected life and death in the Pacific skies. David also discovered the loneliness that came with responsibility. While his comrades could share fears, laughs, and moments of relief, he often found himself isolated in thought, carrying knowledge that could never be fully expressed. Decisions made on the runway echoed through his mind long after engines cooled. At times, the burden seemed heavier than any plane, any storm, or any enemy fire. Command was a constant negotiation with fate, assigning men to missions, knowing some might not return, balancing aggression with caution. It was a delicate dance. The Pacific had no mercy, and the enemy would exploit hesitation, fatigue, and doubt. David learned quickly that leadership was measured not in glory, but in the careful preservation of what could be saved, and the silent acceptance of what could not. By the end of each day, whether the squadron returned whole or diminished, the weight remained. He carried it to the shore, to the tents, to the jungle edges where the wind whispered secrets. Command had transformed from a duty to an invisible companion, relentless, judgmental, and inseparable. It was a responsibility that would follow him across every flight, every horizon, and every shadow in the endless Pacific sky. In a war fought across thousands of miles of ocean and countless islands, information was as valuable as fuel or ammunition. David quickly learned that rumors spread as easily as fire, and often carried truths as dangerous as lies. The Pacific brimmed with whispers of enemy movements, secret weapons, spies, and betrayals, and separating fact from fiction was a challenge in itself. The airfield was always alive with chatter. Mechanics, pilots, and even cooks shared snippets of intelligence, speculation, or stories they had heard secondhand. Sometimes these were mundane. A bomber spotted on a distant island, new anti-aircraft batteries installed near a supply route. Other times, they were chilling. Reports of Japanese scouts infiltrating base perimeters, saboteurs working in the shadows, or planes that had been followed back to our own territory before vanishing mysteriously. David learned to listen carefully. Not every story was credible, but within the exaggerations and fear, there were kernels of truth that could make the difference between life and death. One evening, a flight mechanic whispered that a squadron of enemy fighters had been sighted tracking our reconnaissance planes, using tactics they hadn't seen before. The report was unconfirmed, but David filed it mentally, adjusting flight patterns and briefings for the next day. That small act, paying attention to rumor, saved lives. Espionage wasn't just an abstract threat. It was everywhere. Locals, even those friendly to the Allied forces, could be watched, coerced, or bribed. Supply lines were vulnerable. Messages could be intercepted. Even letters from home could be delayed or scrutinized. David realized that in a war waged across islands and vast ocean expanses, trust was fragile, and secrecy was paramount. Sometimes, the rumors carried a strange mix of fear and superstition. Pilots would talk quietly about the eyes in the clouds, shadowy figures they couldn't explain, movements that suggested the enemy was always watching, even from a distance. Others spoke of cryptic messages in coded signals, intercepted but unintelligible, hinting at operations far beyond what anyone could predict. The line between reality and imagination blurred, especially after long hours in the cockpit, sweat and adrenaline mingling with exhaustion. David became adept at interpreting these whispers. A subtle hesitation in a fellow pilot's voice, a mechanic lingering too long over a fuel line, or a sudden report of movement on a distant island could signal something more significant. Information had to be filtered through experience, instinct, and careful observation. Every rumor could contain life-saving clues, or it could lead a squadron into a trap. Even within the squadron, mistrust occasionally crept in. Pilots feared that secrets might leak, that someone could be compromised, even unknowingly. Quiet conversations turned into strategic discussions, and the careful exchange of intelligence became an invisible game, requiring intuition and discretion. David found himself weighing not just enemy movements, but the reliability of those around him. Leadership in the Pacific demanded constant vigilance, not only in the sky but in the whispering shadows on the ground. Some rumors proved true, others proved fatal. A misjudged piece of intelligence could send a pilot directly into enemy fire or a storm. A carefully observed whisper, however, could reveal an ambush, uncover a hidden base, or give just enough time to evade disaster. Over time, David realized that survival was as much about understanding what was said in hushed tones as it was about mastering the cockpit or reading the clouds. By nightfall, the airfield seemed alive with invisible threads of information, connecting every pilot, mechanic, and officer to the islands, the ocean, and the enemy beyond. Rumors were more than chatter. They were maps, warnings, and lessons disguised in whispers. For David, navigating these unseen currents became as critical as navigating the skies, because one mistake, one ignored rumor, could mean the difference between life and oblivion. Even amidst the constant motion of planes, engines, and airfield activity, a profound sense of isolation crept over the men in the Pacific. David learned quickly that no amount of camaraderie, letters, or legends could fully bridge the gap between those at home and those fighting above endless waves of water. The isolation was not just physical, though thousands of miles separated them from families. It was mental, emotional, and existential. The islands themselves reinforced this separation. Small, remote, and surrounded by an indifferent ocean, they felt like the edges of the world. Nights were particularly oppressive. The jungle and ocean merged into a vast, living darkness. The hum of insects and the ceaseless surf became the only constants. Pilots, after long flights and close calls, would sit silently under the stars, feeling both the immense beauty and the unyielding emptiness of their surroundings. David noticed that isolation changed people. Some became introspective, talking less, recording thoughts in notebooks that no one else would read. Others became reckless, seeking thrills in the air to push back against the quiet, to remind themselves they were alive. Small conflicts flared over minor misunderstandings, magnified by the constant tension. Loneliness had a way of making every word, every gesture, feel weighty. The psychological isolation was compounded by the relentless rhythm of missions. Each flight demanded focus, energy, and vigilance. There was no time to dwell on home, on the friends who had disappeared, or the lives left behind. Even sleep offered little relief. Dreams carried the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire. David began to notice that pilots would often wake mid-sentence in conversation, or jump at the sound of a distant engine, their nerves never fully relaxed. Yet, paradoxically, isolation forged deep bonds among the men. The shared knowledge that each person had witnessed horrors, close calls, and near-death experiences created a connection that transcended words. Trust became absolute and immediate. A pilot depended on his wingman not just for strategy or protection, but for sanity, the reassurance that someone else understood, someone else had survived alongside him. Even so, moments of profound solitude remained unavoidable. David often walked the shoreline alone, listening to the waves, letting his thoughts drift. The Pacific stretched endlessly, indifferent to survival or heroism. In these moments, he grappled with questions that had no answers. Why he had survived, why some of his friends had not, and whether the small victories of the day held any meaning in the larger chaos of the war. Isolation also revealed the subtle, invisible costs of leadership. Every choice, every directive, added a layer of solitude. While pilots in the squadron could share stories and fears, the weight of responsibility often left David with thoughts he could not voice. Assigning men to dangerous missions, calculating risks, and witnessing losses left him alone with decisions that would echo long after the engines had cooled. The islands and the endless ocean created a world suspended in time, where each day felt like a small eternity. Nature, the enemy, and the vast distances combined to emphasize the smallness of human life, yet demanded everything from those who survived. And David, like all pilots, learned that isolation was not a temporary state, but a constant companion, one that sharpened perception, hardened resolve, and reminded him that no matter the company around him, each man was ultimately alone in the sky. As darkness fell and the stars emerged over the Pacific, David stared at the horizon, aware that tomorrow would bring the same solitude, the same challenges, and the same relentless demands of survival. In this isolation, he realized the war was not just fought with planes and guns. It was fought in the mind, in the soul, in the quiet spaces where fear, memory, and endurance met and tangled like the waves on the shore. Even in the isolation of the Pacific, the war was never static. Whispers of new aircraft, experimental weapons, and radical technology traveled faster than the wind over the islands. David quickly realized that keeping ahead of these rumors could mean the difference between life and death. Sometimes, the mere knowledge of a potential enemy advancement reshaped entire missions before they even began. The pilots talked about planes that could fly faster than anything they had encountered, armed with guns capable of cutting through armor that had once seemed invincible. Some reports claimed radar-equipped fighters patrolling at dawn, tracking every move of reconnaissance squadrons. Others mentioned innovations in bombsight technology, torpedoes with unusual guidance systems, or engines that could outlast any endurance test. The truth was often murky, but every story carried a kernel of potential threat. David learned to treat rumors with caution. One evening, a pilot returned from a recon flight over a distant island and whispered about a new type of enemy aircraft, faster and more agile than any Zero he had seen. The description was vague, almost impossible to verify, but David adjusted formation tactics, flight altitudes, and engagement protocols anyway. It was better to prepare for a threat that might not exist than to be caught off guard. Mechanics also spoke of experimental equipment rumored to be installed in certain squadrons, reinforced fuselages, improved radios, and even early forms of autopilot. Some of these inventions never reached the front, lost in testing or sabotage, but the rumors alone affected morale. Pilots debated their effectiveness, sometimes arguing for days, using the whispers as both hope and fear. Interestingly, the Pacific itself seemed to generate its own technology rumors. Stories circulated about islands housing secret weapons caches, hidden radar posts, or supply drops that appeared mysteriously in the night. Some of these tales were based on observations of unusual activity, others on pure imagination. David found that even false rumors could influence strategy. Pilots would change routes, delay flights, or fly higher to avoid unseen dangers. The psychological impact of these rumors was profound. Pilots approached every mission with heightened awareness, eyes scanning for subtle differences in enemy planes or movements. The knowledge or suspicion of advanced technology created a tension that simmered constantly, sharpening instincts but also magnifying stress. Even minor anomalies in the sky could trigger adrenaline spikes, a reflex developed in response to months of listening to whispers of unseen weapons. David began to realize that rumor and technology were inseparable in the Pacific War effort. The faster the information traveled, the greater its impact, whether real or imagined. Commanders relied on reports filtered through multiple layers of observation, while pilots absorbed every piece of information, merging fact and speculation into the decisions that would guide life and death in the skies. And while some rumors proved accurate, others led to disastrous overreactions or miscalculations. One misidentified silhouette could cause a formation to scatter, leaving gaps for actual enemy attacks. A misheard report could divert fuel, ammunition, and attention away from genuine threats. Survival depended not only on flying skill but also on discernment, the ability to separate the credible from the fanciful, to act decisively in the murky space between reality and rumor. In this world, David understood every advantage counted, no matter how small. Every whisper of new technology, every hint of experimental weapons, was both a warning and an opportunity. To navigate the Pacific skies successfully, a pilot had to listen, interpret, and respond, often before seeing the threat with his own eyes. The rumors were a shadow war in themselves, invisible yet powerful, shaping decisions, strategy, and survival in ways that no plane, no gun, and no mission briefing could fully encompass. And as night fell over the island, David gazed at the horizon, imagining the planes that might be waiting beyond the clouds, engines humming, unseen, and ready to test every lesson he had learned, every skill he had honed, and every ounce of instinct he carried into the Pacific sky. Amidst all the machines, weapons, and rumors of advanced technology, David came to realize that the true factor in the Pacific War was not steel or gunpowder, but human beings, their instincts, fears, courage, and fragility. Pilots, ground crews, and commanders were constantly tested, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior often had more impact than any machine. David noticed it first in the squadron rotations. Pilots returned from missions battered but alive, their reactions unpredictable. Some were exhilarated, their confidence soaring after narrowly surviving combat. Others were subdued, haunted by close calls and the ghosts of men who had not returned. A single human misjudgment could ripple through the squadron, impacting formation cohesion, engagement strategy, and morale. Leadership, David learned, was less about technical skill and more about reading people. Knowing which pilot could handle extreme stress, who could maintain focus under fire, and who needed encouragement or even subtle restraint could determine survival. He observed the subtle cues: a tightened grip on the controls, a forced laugh, or an unusual silence. Every detail mattered, and the cost of ignoring it could be fatal. the human element extended beyond individual pilots. Ground crews, mechanics, and medics played equally vital roles. A misaligned engine, a poorly maintained fuel line, or a delayed repair could mean the difference between life and death in the air. David learned to treat each person as part of an intricate web, every role interconnected, every mistake magnified in consequences. Trust became a currency more valuable than bullets. Pilots depended on wingmen to watch their backs in dogfights. They relied on engineers to prepare planes for impossible maneuvers. Even small lapses in communication or misinterpretation could trigger disaster. David began developing a sixth sense for anticipating human errors, adjusting his plans and tactics to mitigate the inevitable imperfections of those around him. Fear was the most unpredictable human element. Some men thrived under pressure, their adrenaline sharpening their reflexes. Others froze, their minds clouded by instinctive panic. Combat amplified these differences. David had witnessed veteran pilots hesitate for a split second, missing an opportunity that could have saved a life. He realized that understanding fear, predicting its effect, and channeling it productively was as critical as knowing when to pull the trigger. And then there was camaraderie. Amid the relentless danger, the human connections formed in small moments, shared laughter over a burnt meal, quiet conversations beneath a canopy of stars, or mutual respect after a perilous sortie. These bonds provided resilience, a psychological buffer against isolation and trauma. They reminded men that even in the vast, indifferent Pacific, they were not entirely alone. But the human element could also be dangerous when rumors, superstition, or mistrust infiltrated judgment. Panic spread quickly. Miscommunication could turn a routine sortie into chaos. David learned to manage not only missions but the mental atmosphere of his squadron, ensuring that stress and fear were tempered by discipline, experience, and the trust he had painstakingly cultivated. The war in the Pacific was a constant negotiation with human nature. Success was never guaranteed by firepower or speed alone. The men, with all their strengths and flaws, were the ultimate variable. Understanding, anticipating, and sometimes compensating for the unpredictable human element became a crucial part of survival. As essential as the aircraft they flew, as vital as the maps and instruments guiding them through endless skies. David realized that, ultimately, machines could be repaired, strategies adjusted, and missions retried. Humans, however, could not be replaced so easily. Their resilience, endurance, and spirit defined the battle, carried them through storms, and determined who would return to the airfield, and who would become another shadow in the legends of the Pacific. In the Pacific, heroism was rarely celebrated the way stories in books or newspapers portrayed it. David learned that bravery came with a hidden cost, often paid silently, in ways that no medal or commendation could truly measure. Every daring maneuver, every dive into enemy fire, every split-second decision to save a wingman carried consequences that lingered long after the engines cooled. One day, David witnessed a young pilot, barely out of training, pull off an incredible recovery from a near collision with a Zero. The maneuver saved both planes, and on the surface it was a triumph. But later, in the quiet of the tent, he discovered the toll. The young pilot could barely sleep, his hands trembling, reliving the moment over and over. Heroism, in the skies above the Pacific, came hand in hand with fear, guilt, and exhaustion. David himself felt the hidden costs accumulating. Each mission etched subtle scars in his mind. Surviving a dogfight did not erase the memory of the men who had not been so fortunate. Even small acts of courage, protecting a bomber, engaging an enemy to draw fire away from comrades, carried invisible weight. Every decision that saved lives carried the weight of what could have been lost. There were physical costs as well. The stress of constant vigilance, The strain of maneuvering heavy aircraft under duress and the endless hours in the cockpit left their mark. David's hands were calloused, his muscles tense from repeated evasive actions, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Heroism demanded peak performance, and the body paid a silent price in the form of fatigue, soreness, and the slow erosion of endurance. But perhaps the most insidious costs were social and emotional. Pilots returned from missions forever changed, unable to discuss their experiences in detail, burdened with knowledge that civilians and even friends at the base could not fully comprehend. Letters from home could not erase the memories of smoke-filled skies, the smell of burning fuel, or the faces of those who did not return. Heroism became a private, almost secret burden, carried quietly by those who survived. The culture of the airfield reinforced this hidden cost. Praise was rare and acknowledgement even rarer. Survival was expected, courage assumed, and any recognition was fleeting. Pilots learned to mask the mental toll, to continue flying with a stiff smile and a steady hand. Those who faltered quietly disappeared from the narrative, their struggles invisible beneath the endless hum of engines and the roar of the ocean. David observed that heroism also altered relationships. Men became both admired and feared, respected for their skill but envied for the risks they had taken and survived. Bonds were formed in the crucible of danger, but these connections were often fragile, strained by stress, exhaustion, and the unspoken understanding of what each man had endured. Even as victories mounted, David realized that heroism was never free. Each act was a transaction with fate, paid for in mental strain, emotional isolation, and the subtle erosion of the human spirit. The Pacific was an indifferent judge, and it demanded its toll silently, invisibly, often before anyone could recognize the cost. By nightfall, as David walked along the dimly lit airfield, he understood that heroism was less about glory and more about endurance, resilience, and the quiet acceptance of the hidden costs that would follow long after the engines were silent. Every successful sortie, every life saved, was inseparable from fear endured and sacrifice unseen, a constant reminder that in the skies over the Pacific, courage was as taxing as it was necessary.